Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. This has been created for those of us that love radical women who live perhaps by the rules, but also question and challenge the status quo. We want more from our lives, to enjoy our sexuality, to explore radical thought, and to celebrate women who have lived and continue to live unconventional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Toni Baer, sexologist, educator, activist, and definitely a radical woman. Thank you for joining me as I share stories of women challenging the status quo and living life to the fullest. Join me as we unapologetically march to the beat of a different drummer together. Well, Vi, welcome again to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. We've been sharing this all during the year 2021, and it's our inaugural year, and it is very fitting that my very first podcast, Marching to the Beat of a Different Drum, was with you, and now the last broadcast of the year is also with you, and it's probably fitting that today's topic is New York City, since soon the ball goes down and we start another year. So thank you so much for being here. We're going to tell stories tonight, and I can't wait.
Thank you.
But today we are going to take a trip down memory lane to a time long ago, the 1970s. And I asked Vi tonight if she would tell me her coming out story. But I made it a little bit harder than that. I asked, can you tell me your coming out story and what it was like, what it smelled like, what it looked like, what it tasted like to be in New York City in the 1970s in the kink scene? And without further ado, Ms. Vi Johnson, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Toni, bits and pieces of this story you've heard. It's hard to believe I need to back you up almost 50 years. You know, when the kids talk about old school, they're talking about 20 years ago, and I'm going, we have a timeline discrepancy. What was it like to come out? The first person I came out to was my mother, whose embrace and love of Jill I thought was normal. She simply said, I have two daughters, end of story. But finding a place to go, now that was a different ballgame.
Now, you both met in college?
College and graduate school.
Okay.
I was in graduate school in New Jersey, and Jill worked for me. Jill was an undergraduate, I was a graduate student. Some of that story is in the book, so we don't need to get into that. But from there, things got a little complicated. One, she worked for me and I was her boss. That meant tiptoeing around a whole lot of things. Two, even though I was in graduate school studying housing and student personnel, I was a certified teacher in the state of New Jersey. And teachers' contracts have morals clauses. And one of those little catchphrases that could have my license snatched had to do with homosexuality. So not only could we not really spend time in each other's room other than for professional reasons, one, because anyone might have knocked on my door at any given time, but two, that morals clause is a serious thing, and I just spent a whole lot of the state's money getting my teaching license. I didn't want to lose it. So we were running off to New York, which was a city that I knew pretty well, having grown up about 40 minutes by bus, 15 minutes as the crow flies, and 20 minutes with bad driving into Midtown Manhattan. I knew the city. It's just that I had never had a reason, no harm, no foul. I just never had a reason to go into a lesbian bar. And now I'd fallen in love with a woman. We needed a place to go. Started asking very discreetly around for phone books and things on human sexuality in the New York area. And someone made a joke about the original Fernando's Hideaway. Found out that while it was the wrong name, it actually was a little bar on 19th Street, originally called Gianni's, then ultimately called Casa Maria when it changed hands. It was an easy hop, skip, and a jump through the Lincoln Tunnel. So Jill and I would run off to Casa Maria to be able to sit and laugh together and not have to worry about who was looking over our shoulders. There were other signs up in the bar for a couple of different bars because there wasn't a lot of competition amongst the bars back then. It was more sharing. There was Bonnie and Clyde's, much closer to the Village, and Paula's. And we were willing to be out in those quiet environments as leather women, or as women, but not so much out as leather women. That was pretty quiet. And then Jill decided, again, the braver of the two of us, that there had to be people like us, and we were going to find them.
Can I back you up a little bit? How did you know you were a leather woman? And how did that come about? I mean, okay, you kind of had an attraction towards one another. That I get the lesbian part. You don't have to draw me a picture. But leather woman?
See, what had happened was actually, we would have to go back to those early college weeks and months. I told you Jill worked for me. And I had looked into the records of all of the resident assistants on my staff. They all had wonderful academic records, except kind of sort of one that was going to hell quickly in a handbasket. One of my RAs had gone from straight A's to B's and then to C's pretty quickly, like in a matter of months. And I was told in my first staff meeting with the dean after I was hired as a graduate assistant that my job was to keep one person out of the hair of the dean of students, the dean of women, and the dean of residents. And that person's name was Jill Carter. Okay, at our first staff meeting, she lied to me, and she's only done that twice in 48 years. Both of them within the first 8 months we were together, actually. And I started deciding that there were not that many Black students on campus. Maybe I ought to figure out what was going on here, because if I didn't, this kid was going to lose her scholarships and flunk out of school. So I decided that I was going to find out what made Jill Carter tick. Oh, was that an interesting voyage? I'm still learning, and it's been 48 years. But we talked about poetry. We talked then more about her poetry. She showed me some of it. Beautifully written, interesting imagery in a few of them. And then we talked about all of the other things, or we began to talk about as I learned about her, all of the other things that made Jill Jill, including the fact that she had a Mac fantasy. Now, the difference in our backgrounds was kind of interesting. While both of us had been brought up in religious households, mine was an interesting religious mixed bag, and hers was very straightforward, rather strict Southern Baptist. So some things she snuck off as girls do to talk to their girlfriends and find out about, and some things I just didn't have a clue about. One of which was what the word Mac meant, or more importantly, what the hell was a fantasy? That actually took an awful lot of explaining, as funny as it sounds. Mostly because if I want a hamburger, I'm not fantasizing, it's a steak. If I want a steak, I'm going to go have a steak. So why do I need to have a fantasy about it? A lot of conversations later, we got around to what the hell is a pimp, because a Mac was the slang for a pimp. I opened the door that led me down a road I'm still learning about. She explained all of this, explained the fantasy somehow. And I still don't know how it happened. I got engrossed in the stories of Jill's fantasy, and then we started acting them out. And the next thing I knew, my life was changing rather drastically. That continued. That more than rough sex, the stories and the enactments that went on with it as we were playing around with those fantasies in bed and in a few other places where you probably shouldn't be doing things like that. But, you know, there is a certain thrill to getting caught. And those nights escalated and the time got longer and the games got rougher and a whole lot more real. And some of those things in chasing those fantasies got a little risky. And that's when she said, there have to be other people who are doing this, and we're going to have to find them.
Did you have a name for it at that time?
Not really. I had the clinical sadism and masochism that comes up in psych classes. That comes up in psychology classes, good Lord, occasionally in literature, because I had read some of the work of Desaad for other classes. Okay, so there's a basic intellectual understanding of this, but exactly how does all that fit in? We didn't know.
Right. Now, would you have called yourself an SM dyke at that time or a leather woman? Because, you know, the folks in the UK are still SM dykes and not necessarily leather women.
Actually, at that point, neither. We're going back to 74. The term dyke wasn't used that often. It was actually lesbian. When this separation was made at all, because in the early 70s, for the most part, we were still gay. Male or female, the most common term was gay. And as to what it was we were doing, didn't have a label at all. Right. Found a little, went running off to an adult bookstore about 50 miles from the school. Found a couple of newspapers and a few magazines that looked kind of promising, grabbed the trophies, walked out, and found a little ad in the back of one of them that said, masochist, is it curable? Come to. There was an address on the bottom, and Jill said, we're going. We did. Stood in the back of a room, in a doorway, actually. The only person who could see us was the person leading the meeting, because everyone else had their back to the door. And the man who was leading the meeting said, come in, little sisters, you're home. The man was a beautiful, bald, black man wearing glasses named Jack Jackson. And the meeting was Eulenspiegel, the Eulenspiegel Society, now called TESS. They still use Eulenspiegel, most people don't get it. For about 2.5 years of forming family and intensely learning, we realized we were a bit of an anomaly because we were a woman-to-woman couple in a group that was predominantly heterosexual. Met two wonderful men who ended up being both brothers and mentors to us by the name of Tom and Jerry McNichol at a gay pride march, actually, because we saw them, they saw Jill and me with me on leash, and we all just started talking and learning. And Jerry, who was the slave and about 6'6", to his master Tom, who was about 5'7", took me under his wing and made us realize that there was a place for us within the larger gay community, that this wasn't a heterosexual phenomenon, that it was just a sexual expression, that those who had the drive did. Yes, we did it differently, but we did. He started insisting that Jill and I start hanging out in certain places in New York with them. The Dock Street, when it was still the dock, not the pretty little thing that it is today, when it was dark and seedy and falling apart and full of old places where boats hadn't been docked in years, became a second home, as did all the stores on the Dock Street, stores and bars. Badlands on the corner. Jojo Hughes store right down the street that was open until 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, selling equipment to the boys who were going to all of the bars on the dock and might have forgotten collar, leash, armband, or whatever, so they drop into her store and pick them up. A fight or two here and there in the Ramrod, the Spike, the Vault, or Hellfire. And learning and realizing that not only were we not alone, there were an awful lot of other women just like us.
Now, in the 1970s, right, New York City is seedy in general, right? Like Times Square and all the porn stores. And so this dock area is not different than other neighborhoods, right? It's a different place than it is today, or no?
It was dark. It was seedy. It was reeking of sexuality, but it wasn't all dark. As a matter of fact, it was two worlds, a little like yin and yang, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mostly because of the crucible that became Eulenspiegel. The bars were interesting places to be, in that in my day, in 75, 6, 7, 8, for one thing, there were very few women who were out. We had some of our founding mothers, Jo Arnone, Dorothy Allison, Monique Van Cleef had been busted in the 60s and gone back to Europe. A few other women, a few other babes on bikes. But we were kind of welcome, but we also had an understanding that we weren't to be there after a certain hour. You know, so hanging out at Badlands on a Sunday and sitting on the bars and talking to the bartenders or talking to some of our brothers who were there, not a big deal. Little sister, this is actually how you do this. Yeah, sloppy knot, do it over again. Or going across the street into the docks and being told to just stand there. No matter what you do not move. I couldn't see who was around me. And yet, if Jerry said, stand there, I stood there. There were other hands that touched me, other hands that felt me, other hands that went up and down my shirt. But I knew it had to be safe because Jerry wouldn't have left me somewhere that wasn't. But in all of that learning, there was still Tess, there was still Eulenspiegel. And by 77 or so, gay men were coming to Tess. But an interesting phenomenon that those of us who were poor and or working class didn't know about was that the wealthy uptown crowd, and yes, there was one, were also coming down to Tess. And we began to make connections with the uptown clubs. And those of us who wanted more than just 1 or 2 nights a week at Eulenspiegel started opening clubs. Bob and Penny Mason opened up a little place. It was basically, they took over a local bar 2 nights a week and called it Chateau 19. It was a place where we could hang out. It was also a place where a woman named Jenny Graham Scott hung out. And in watching and learning and talking, ended up writing 2 very well-known books. For those who wanted something a little less trying on the knees, a wonderful couple named Lois and Judy opened up something a little bit more glamorous. 5 or 6 rooms, plus a pool hall and carpeting and padding so thick, I literally could pick you up and bounce you, because the submissive or slave there didn't want slaves' knees. So she designed the club to make sure she could play. When JoJo wasn't minding her store, she was also running and a partner in the swing club Plato's Retreat, and had SM nights at Plato's Retreat. And it was an amazing learning atmosphere. But that anomaly of Jill and me, of being a woman-to-woman Black couple, got invited to a lot of different places, including the Uptown clubs, one of which I got my training in. And then the boys decided that some of the men's spaces were wasted during the week and the early part of the weekend. So Linnie Waller, who passed away only a few years ago, got together with a man named Dave Vangan and opened up, talk about seedy, a club that has a reputation that pretty much still stands today, called Hellfire. I am convinced that there were probably bacteria on those walls that started the plague. And yet I felt more comfortable and more safe there than I did right not too far down the street at, I think it was the 19th precinct. I was at home at Hellfire. I was with family at Hellfire. The few leather bars that we had understood that, you know, especially for women, leave early. You know, don't interfere with that all male space, but come on in and have a drink. We did. And we met and talked and shared because of that. But I also think that was one of the founding energies for gay male SM activists, GMSMA, and for the sister group that popped up only a year or 2 later, and that was the Lesbian Sex Mafia.
So Vi, take us into the Hellfire. Let's
okay.
Take me on a date. What would it be like? Like if we went through the door and went in there. Give me a picture of what it looks like and feels like and the sounds like.
Before you went through the door, first you had to find it. Those that knew. Off of 9th near 14th, I think, was the close cross street. It was just any other building. With no
sign?
None whatsoever. No
a
sign,
light outside?
No sign, no number. You had to know where you were going to know where you were going. Usually park the car around the corner, and I'm trying to remember what the intersection was. Because there was a lot there that was for another company that everybody parked it at night because nobody was going to be there. About 100 yards past, no, that's a lie, about 30 yards past the corner. You walked in the door. I realized there was a door there, but it was always open. So if you knew what you were doing, you just walked in. Down 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 steps, getting a little darker as you went down the stairs because there was a street light, you know, within about 10 foot of the door. So you could at least see the stairs, old stone stairs. I was always told that it was an old and abandoned subway station, that had been reclaimed. Down the stairs and a turn to the left, and down a hallway that was probably about 25 feet, getting darker as it went. On the left, about 15 foot in, was a coat check that was lit well enough so that you could see it. You could barely see the light as you were walking down the hall. And just past the coat check was the check-in desk. Usually Lenny was sitting there, or Dave was sitting there, or one of their boys and or partners. Women were let in free. The guys ended up paying, it was nominal fee back then. I think it was $5 or $6. I can't remember exactly how much. And it seemed to me that they finally wised up to the fact that single women, single meaning you were alone or you were a woman-to-woman couple, got let in free. If you were a head couple, I think it was $10 or something. I can't remember the exact charge. So you got the look up and down, either paid your money or showed your membership card. And yes, Hellfire had membership cards that expired once every 3 months, 4 months. And you went a little farther down the hall, and a slight bend to the left into the first main room. Now, when the club originally opened, there was a little bar back there. The room was probably 25 by 35 with other rooms off of it. The main room, you're still standing on this stone floor. Had a small play area, if you could call it that. It was a huge frame. And originally there was a motorcycle hanging from one of the four sides of the frame, and chains and other things that were hanging around it so that somebody could be strung up. If you walked around it and past it, a guy named Bill Katz was selling toys at a little table in the back. And if you turned slightly right and walked past Bill, you walked into one of Hellfire's many back rooms, which, if you can imagine, were even lower lit than the main room, which was fairly low light. There were 3, I think, small rooms, 3 walls each, not 4, off that one back room. And you could come out, make a left, go down about 10 more feet, and do the same thing again with 2 or 3 other rooms. Or if you were feeling really brave, you came back out of that little enclave, made a left, and then moved slightly past it into the toilet. Now, that took a lot more guts than I usually exhibited, mostly because I have a very sensitive nose, and I couldn't always get past the smell. Now, toilet room was for whoever wanted to engage in yellow or brown sports, and they had not only the usual urinals and an open toilet, they also had an open bathtub. An old white, well, I'm sure at one point in time it had been white, clawfoot that was up on a pedestal. And usually about half the time there was somebody in there, either waiting to be pissed on, waiting to be sat on, waiting to be given orders, or hoping that the man or woman of their dreams would come in and utilize the services.
And this is a private club.
This is Hellfire, yeah.
And they serve drinks?
Yes and no. When the club first opened, there was a small bar there. There were a few places where you could leave your own small bottle. And then I can't remember why they actually stopped serving alcohol, but they didn't really mind if you brought a small bottle, nothing that could be a danger, because I don't remember ever honestly seeing glass on the floor, from something that might have broken. And God knows they might not have cleaned it up anyway, such was the nature of the club. But
would you say this wasn't a dungeon, a club, or would you call this a cruising spot?
Yes, to all of them. But New York had SM nightclubs. You might find a little entertainment. Sometimes the play was the entertainment. Chateau 19 was a small club. Club O was an SM nightclub. It had a stage. It had live role-playing theater that could be going on. It had pro doms, our canaries in the coal mine, and that's a whole nother story, because the pro had a very important place in New York's early days. The pros might have been doing scenes on stage. There might have been other entertainment on stage, as well as the phenomenon of the club itself. Club O did serve liquor, and had an incredible and gorgeous bar in one of its rooms. Yes, there were toys, but it was more than a dungeon. For one thing, Club O was much brighter in terms of the ability to actually see what was happening around there and see it with beautiful lights and a gorgeous atmosphere. The Club de Sade was similar, but much smaller. When John Luana and Honey Smythe opened Les Seines, they took the best of all of them, had 2 or 3 stories, I honestly can't remember at this point in time, had entertainment going on one, had a pool room there, as well as what you would now call dungeon and or play space and cruising space. There were playrooms back then, not really our dungeons, but terminology also changes. But they were considered clubs, not patch clubs, the equivalent of an SM nightclub. And
best point right there. We're going to cut this segment. We're at a half an hour, right? Which is fine.
And I didn't have that far to go, so it's a perfect place. We had the nightclubs.
Yeah. So I think that's perfect for the cut. Your coming out experience with Jill and having to find a place to go. And then you described all of these kinds of places, right, to go.
New York got to the point where after a test meeting, we went off and we all had meals together. But you could do something in New York City that was SM/leather related 6 nights a week. And the joke was there would never be 7 because even God rested one night.
Thank you so much for tuning in today to the Radical Rhythm podcast. Special thanks to Ms. Vi Johnson of the Leather Library and Collection in Evansville, Indiana. The Voyages of Aphrodite is a free Facebook group. If you are female identified and interested in talking about your sexuality and being amongst other women who are also interested in empowering one another, please find it on Facebook or on the link below and join the group. It's free. You might also see that there's another group, the Voyagers of Aphrodite. It's called the Voyagers Club Inner Circle. This group is a paid subscription program, And it's a place where I go in every month and hold seminars based upon the challenges that are being faced amongst the women in the group. This is also a group dedicated to working on their sexuality and specifically bringing joy into their life. And it truly brings me joy to work with them almost on a daily basis within our group. If you're interested, again, there is a link below. Last but not least, if you like the Radical Rhythm podcast, it's free. It's on YouTube and soon to be on Spotify and Apple and SoundCloud. Please click the button below, subscribe, so that you don't miss the next episode. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to talking to you once again from the Carter Johnson Leather Library next week.